All right, we are live. Perfect. A video seems to have been gone viral. One of my buddies was talking about it. He mentioned about this one channel. I don't know how to say their name. Something a very German name, Kurd, Scott, something like that. And they released a video about talking about the population collapse in South Korea. And we also know that that's a very general topic that people talk about on Twitter, especially Elon. He keeps talking about population collapse. So let's dig into it. Is population collapse real? It's definitely real. This is just a controversial question, like fun way to ask the question. But let's see. Often framed as dramatic, rapid decline in global or regional populations, is a topic of heated debate. The core concern stems from declining birth rates in many developed countries, aging populations, and projections of potential economic and social strain. Here's a breakdown based on available data and reasoning. It also makes sense that maybe as humans got advanced, they didn't need to reproduce kids just for the sake of human labor. There was a time when if you have a massive field and you wanted you didn't you don't have money to hire people, then you would make babies, and then those kids, your kids, will work on the field. So that was a way to manage labor. But we don't have to do that anymore. And in general, people are not choosing to have kids. So, yes, there was an explosion of kids just because we were in the pre-industrial revolution, and after the industrial revolution there were just no more need for it. So this is my high level understanding right now, but let's go into it. Evidence supporting population collapse concerns: declining fertility rates. Global fertility rates have dropped significantly. The UN and World Bank data show the global average fertility rate fell from 4.8 children per woman in 1970 to about 2.4 in 2020. In countries like Japan, South Korea, and much of Europe, rates are below the replacement level of 2.1. This trend suggests shrinking populations over time, absent immigration. This trend suggests shrinking populations over time, absent immigration or policy shifts. Aging population. In developed nations, low birth rates and longer lifespans are creating top heavy demographics. Japan's median age is 48, and by 2050, 36% of its population is projected to be over 65. This strains pension systems, healthcare, and labor markets, potentially leading to economic stagnation. Regional declines. Some countries are already shrinking. Japan's population peaked at 128 million in 2008 and is projected to fall to 97 million by 2050. Hmm. Eastern Europe, like Bulgaria and Ukraine, have seen population drops of 10 to 20% since 1990 due to low fertility and immigration. Wow. Immigration is so real for those countries because if the younger population is moving out, a lot of younger population is moving out for better opportunities. That is leaving the country without the future. Wow. Wow. That's crazy actually. Like if there's a country where there's a lot of emigration of the younger population, they are at a massive risk because they are at a massive risk of just wiping out. Wow. Economic impacts. Fewer workers supporting more retirees can reduce GDP growth and innovation. Studies OECD reports warn of labor shortages and fiscal pressures in low fertility nations. Fewer workers supporting more retirees can reduce GDP growth and innovation. Labor shortages and fiscal pressures in low fertility nation. Counter arguments and nuances. Global population growth. While developed nations face decline, global population is still growing, projected to peak around 2080 at 10.4 billion. Sub-Saharan Africa, with fertility rates like 4.6 in Nigeria, continue to drive growth, offsetting declines elsewhere. Immigration. Countries like the US, Canada, and Australia maintain population stability through immigration. The US fertility rate is 1.6, but net immigration keeps its population growing slowly, 0.4% annually. Adaptation. Technological advancement, AI, automation, policy changes, childcare subsidies, immigration reform could mitigate labor shortages and economic impacts. Historical predictions of demographic doom, like Malthusian collapse, often over. What is Malthusian collapse? So, Nigeria, you can see like basically the countries with the highest fertility rates, they obviously will move out of the country for better opportunities, and then you can see like who's going to take over the world, kind of, in a way, where what people people what's the best way to phrase this, you'll just see like people from which countries all will be all around the world. Adaptation, technological advancement, AI automation, policy changes, childcare subsidies, immigration reform could mitigate labor shortages and economic impacts. Historical predictions of demographic doom, like Malthusian collapse, often overestimated rigidity and underestimated adaptability. Hmm. Overestimated rigidity and underestimated adaptability, non uniform. Collapse implies catastrophe, but declines are gradual and uneven. China's population is shrinking 1.4 billion to 1.3 billion projected by 2050, but India's is still growing. Context matters. Collapse implies catastrophe, but declines are gradual and uneven. China's population is shrinking 1.4 billion to 1.3 billion projected by 2050, but India's is still growing. Critiques of the collapse narrative. Alarmism. Some argue the term collapse is exaggerated, used to push political agendas, anti immigration, or pro natalist policies. Gradual decline isn't synonymous with societal failure. Cultural factors. Low fertility often correlates with higher education, women's empowerment, and urbanization. Trends many view as positive, forcing higher birth rates could clash with individual freedoms. Cultural factors. Low fertility often correlates with higher education, women's empowerment, and urbanization. Trends many view as positive, forcing higher birth rates could clash with individual freedoms. Environmental upside. Some environmentalists argue population decline and high consumption nations could reduce ecological strain aligning with climate goals. Post on X reflect polarized views. Some users amplify collapse fears, citing low birth rates and cultural decay, often with apocalyptic rhetoric, often dismissing it as overhype, pointing to global growth or questioning pronatalist motives. Topic resonates emotionally, often tied to identity or economic anxieties. Declines are happening in specific regions driven by low fertility and aging with real economic and societal challenges. But global population is still rising and societies have tools, immigration, technology, policy to adapt. The term collapse often overstates the issue, ignoring the gradual timelines of inhuman resilience. A Malthusian collapse refers to a scenario where population growth outstrips resources, leading to catastrophic societal failure, as predicted by Thomas Malthus in his 1798 work, An Essay on the Principle of Population. Yeah, this is how you know that you have something good, when you can just create a very general, like, if you have the right content, if you have good quality content, and then if you make a very general topic, that, like, a principle of population, if you're writing a population, or if your essay is called An Essay on the Principle of Population, you know it's going to be a hit. It's like a SEO thing, leading to catastrophic societal failure. Malthus argued that population grows geometrically, exponentially, while food production increases arithmetically, linearly, inevitably causing resource scarcity, famine, disease, or conflict to check population growth. Warned that without voluntary checks, delayed marriage, celibacy, positive checks like starvation or war could reduce positive checks like starvation or war could reduce population to sustainable levels. Critiques and outcomes. He underestimated technological progress, the Industrial Revolution, agricultural innovation, crop rotation, fertilizer, and later the Green Revolution massively increased food production, averting widespread collapse. Global population grew from 1 billion in 1800 to 8 billion by 2022, yet famine became less frequent in developed regions. Modern evidence and risk. Resource strain. Global food production has kept pace with population growth. Global per capita food supply rose 10% from 1990 to 2020. However, localized scarcity persists. 828 million people faced hunger in 21. Climate change, water shortages, and soil degradation threaten yields, especially in vulnerable regions like sub Saharan Africa. Population trends. Unlike Malthus's era, global fertility rates are falling, 2.4 in 2020 versus 4.8 in 1970 per World Bank. Population is projected to peak at 10.4 billion by 2080, driven by high fertility regions like Africa. But many developed nations face population decline, not overgrowth. Energy and environment. Malthus did not account for non food resources, fossil fuel dependency, rare earth metal demand, and ecological limits. Carbon budgets create modern analogs to Malthusian constraints. For example, IPCC models warn of climate driven disruptions to agriculture and migration by 2050 if emissions aren't curbed. Inequality, resource distribution matters more than raw availability. Wealthy nations consume disproportionately. US uses 25% of global energy with 4% of population. Wow. Malthusian's China crisis could hit poor regions even if global resources suffice. Counter arguments, technological optimism, innovations like precision agriculture, lab grown food, renewable energy, and AI driven resource management could continue to outpace population pressures. Historical Malthusian predictions failed because they underestimated human ingenuity. Demographic transition. As education and wealth rise, fertility rates drop, reducing population pressure. Most countries are moving toward or below replacement level fertility, diffusing exponential growth fears. Adaptation. Societies have historically adapted to resource constraints through trade, migration, or policy. China's former one child policy, global cooperation could mitigate localized crisis. All right, China has the one child policy. Exposed to Malthusian collapse are niche but polarized. Some users invoke Malthus to warn of overpopulation, climate collapse, or food insecurity, often tying it to anti immigration or degrowth views. Others mock Malthusian fears as outdated, citing tech progress or declining birth rates. The term is sometimes used loosely, more as a rhetorical device than a rigorous framework. What were the effects of China's former one child policy? Let's see. Implemented from, oh wow, I don't know this was that long. Implemented from 1980 to 2015. That's a long time. Wow. China's one child policy implemented from 1980 to 2015 aimed to control population growth, to alleviate resource strain, and promote economic development. Its effects were profound, reshaping demographics, society, and the economy, with long term consequences still unfolding. Wow. Wow. Population control. The policy significantly reduced population growth. Estimates suggest it prevented 400 million births by 2015. Chinese government claim China's population grew from 980 million in 1980 to 1.37 billion in 2015, slower than projected without the policy. Aging population, low fertility rates falling to 1.6 created a demographic crisis. By 2020, 18.7% of the population was over 60, projected to hit 28% by 2040. The working age population peaked in 2011 is shrinking, straining pension and healthcare systems. Shrinking birth rates. Pension is something interesting because that keeps coming up with the population collapse argument or this entire topic. Shrinking birth rates. Even after the policy ended, fertility remained low as cultural and economic preferences for smaller families persisted. Economic preferences for smaller families persisted. China's population began declining in 2022, earlier than expected. Gender imbalance. Preference for male children led to sex selective abortions and female infanticide. The sex ratio at birth peaked at 121 boys per 100 girls in the 2000s. Normal is 105 to 100. By 2020, China had 30 to 40 million more men than women, creating a bachelor surplus and social stability concerns. Wow. China had 30 to 40 million more men than women, creating a bachelor surplus and so social stability concerns. Wow. 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 Okay. We were here. Okay. Economic effects. Labor force decline. The shrinking working age population down 5.6% from 2011 to 2020 threatens economic growth. Labor shortages are emerging, particularly in manufacturing, and productivity gains are needed to offset the smaller workforce. Economic boost initially, fewer dependents in the 1980s to 2000s, increased savings and investment, fueling China's economic boom. The dependency ratio non workers to workers dropped to 34% in 2010, a demographic dividend. But by 2020, it rose to 45% as the population aged. Rising costs. An aging population increases healthcare and pension costs. By 2035, China's pension system may face a 400 billion deficit. Eldercare demands are straining families and public resources. Hmm. Labor shortages are emerging, particularly manufacturing and productivity gains are needed to offset the smaller workforce. Social effects. Little emperor syndrome. Single children, often spoiled by doting parents and grandparents, faced pressure to succeed. Studies suggest some develop traits like individualism but also entitlement or social isolation. Wow. Single children, often spoiled by doting parents and grandparents, face the pressure to succeed. Studies suggest some develop traits like individualism but also entitlement or social isolation. Family structure changes. The 4-to-1 model, four grandparents, two parents, one child, placed heavy burden on single child to support elders. Traditional multi generational support systems weakened. That is so true. That is so true. Placed heavy burdens on single children to support elders. Traditional multi generational support systems weakened. Gender dynamics. The surplus of men has led to marriage market imbalances, with leftover men in rural areas struggling to find partners. The surplus of men has led to marriage market imbalances, with leftover men in rural areas struggling to find partners. This fuels issues like human trafficking and bride buying from neighborhood countries. Wow. Human rights concerns. Enforcement was often coercive, with forced abortions, sterilizations, and fines for violations, particularly in the 1980s. Rural and ethnic minority families faced less strict rules, but urban Han Chinese bore the brunt. Public resentment grew, contributing to policy relaxation. Policy reversal and long term challenges. This is also interesting when you have a lot of ethnic minority families who are making a lot of babies, but one part of the population isn't making, the other part is making, then they might take over. They might take over. Wow. Policy reversal and long term challenges. End of policy. In 2015, China shifted to a two-child policy, then a three-child policy in 2021, with incentives like subsidies to boost births. However, high living costs, housing prices, and career pressures deter young couples. Fell Births fell to 9.56 million in 2022, the lowest since 1950s. Economic strain. A smaller workforce and aging population threaten China's ability to sustain growth. By 2050, the population is projected to shrink to 1.3 billion, with 400 million over 65, challenging economic stability. Social stability. Gender imbalances and aging related pressures could exacerbate inequality and unrest if not addressed through immigration, automation, or social reforms. Exposed on the one child policy are limited but highlight its legacy. Some users frame it as a demographic disaster, citing aging and gender imbalances. Others view it as a necessary evil for China's economic rise, though coercive methods are widely criticized. Hmm, wow. This little empress syndrome is very interesting. Let's maybe ask this question, keep it in the queue, and we'll see if you want to come back to it. Let's get into this one. Tell me more. China had 30 to 40 million more men than women, creating a bachelor surplus and social stability concerns. Significant legacy of the one child policy. The skewed sex ratio, driven by cultural preferences and policy enforcement, has created social, economic, and stability challenges. Cultural preference for sons, deep rooted Confucian values, and patrilineal traditions prioritize male heirs who are expected to carry the family name, inherit property, and support aging parents. Daughters, often seen as marrying into other families, were less valued in rural and traditional households. One child policy enforcement. The policy limited most urban families to one child, intensifying pressures to ensure that child was male. In rural areas where two children were sometimes allowed, if the first was a girl, this bias persisted. Where two children were sometimes allowed, if the first was a girl, the bias persisted. Sex selective practices, ultrasound technology. From the 1980s, affordable ultrasound machines enabled prenatal sex determination, leading to widespread sex selective abortions. Though illegal, enforcement was lax. Female infanticide and abandonment. In extreme cases, newborn girls were abandoned or neglected, contributing to higher female infant mortality. Orphanages saw a surge in female infants during the policy's early decades. Skewed sex ratios. The sex ratio at birth climbed from 108 boys per 100 girls in 1980 to a peak of 121 to 100 in the mid 2000s. By 2015, it improved slightly to 115 but remained imbalanced. Scale of the bachelor surplus. By 2020, China had approximately 723 million men and 689 million women, a gap of 34 million. Some estimates factoring in underreported female births place the surplus as high as 40 million. Age cohort impact. The imbalance is most acute among those born during the policy's peak enforcement, now in their 20s and 30s, prime marriageable age. For example, in the 20 to 39 age group, there were 17 million more men than women in 2020. Geographic variation. Rural areas where son preferences were stronger and enforcement stricter face worse imbalances. Urban areas with more progressive attitudes and immigration are less affected but still skewed. Rural areas where son preference was stronger and enforcement stricter faced worse imbalances. Urban areas with more progressive attitudes and immigration are less affected but still skewed. Social and economic consequences. Marriage market squeeze leftover men. Guan Gun. Millions of men, particularly low income, rural, or less educated ones, struggle to find brides. In some villages, up to 20% of men remain unmarried by their 30s, compared to historical norms of near universal marriage. Bride price inflation. Competition for women has driven up bride prices payments from groom to bride's families, sometimes costing rural men years of savings, 10,000 to 30,000 in poorer regions. This exacerbates financial strain and inequality. Marriage migration. Some men seek brides from poorer neighboring countries like Vietnam, Laos, or Myanmar, leading to cross border bride markets. This has raised concerns about human trafficking and exploitation. Social stability risk, frustration, and alienation. Large numbers of involuntarily single men, often in rural areas, face social isolation and stigma. Studies link surplus male populations to higher rates of crime, violence, and unrest as young men channel frustration into antisocial behavior. Crime and trafficking. The imbalance has fueled illegal activities, including kidnapping and trafficking of, wow, reports estimate tens of thousands of women in Southeast Asia and North Korea have been trafficked into China since 2000s. Urban rural divide. Urban women empowered by education and career opportunities are less likely to marry rural men, deepening regional tensions and perceptions of inequality. Economic impacts. Labor market effects. Single men lacking family responsibilities may prioritize riskier or less stable work, potentially disrupting labor markets. Conversely, the spending on marriage related costs, housing, bride prices can strain savings and consumption. Housing market pressure. Men often need to own property to attract a bride, fueling demand for housing in a market already strained by urbanization. This contributes to China's real estate bubble, with prices in some cities rising 10 to 20% annually in the 2010s. Aging without support. Unmarried men, especially in rural areas, may lack family support in old age, increasing future reliance on state welfare systems already stretched by an aging population. May lack family support in old age, increasing. This is so big. You want to have a family because that's also kind of an insurance for your old age. By growing a family, you know that not only emotionally but also financially you are being taken care of. There is a family support. Government and societal responses. Policy shifts. Since the 2000s, China has tried to address the imbalance, banning sex selective abortion. Laws prohibiting ultrasound for sex determination were strengthened, though enforcement remains uneven. The sex ratio at birth improved to 112 to 100. Promoting gender equality. Campaigns to value daughters, care for girls, and expand women's education and workforce participation have shifted attitudes, especially in urban areas. Population policy changes. The end of the one child policy and three child policy aim to boost births, but low fertility and high living costs limit impact. Cultural changes. Urbanization and women's empowerment are reducing son preference. Educated women increasingly delay or opt out of marriage, further complicating the marriage market with signaling shifting norms. International efforts. China cooperates with Southeast Asian nations to combat bride trafficking, though enforcement is challenging. China cooperates with Southeast Asian nations to combat bride trafficking, though enforcement is challenging. Ongoing challenges and future outlook. Persistent imbalance. The surplus male population will persist for decades as the skewed cohorts age. By 2050, China may still have 20 to 30 million excess men in older age groups, affecting social cohesion. Cultural resistance. Rural areas lag in adopting gender equal values, and economic pressures reinforce traditional expectations for men to marry and provide. Demographic decline. Low fertility 1.3 in 2020 and gender imbalance exacerbate China's shrinking population, projected to fall to 1.3 billion by 2050. This compounds labor shortages and economic challenges. This compounds labor shortages and economic challenges. Social innovation. Solutions like expanding welfare for single men, promoting immigration, or rethinking marriage norms. Polyandry, as seen in some historical contexts, are debated but face cultural and political hurdles. Expanding welfare for single men, promoting immigration, or rethinking marriage norms. On X, discussions about China's gender imbalance are sporadic but often alarmist. Some users highlight the bachelor surplus as a ticking time bomb for social unrest, citing crime or trafficking risk. Others frame it as a cultural tragedy tied to policy missteps, with sympathy for rural men. Critics of the one child policy use the imbalance to argue against state overreach, while some dismiss stability concerns as exaggerated, pointing to urban adaptation. The Little Emperor Syndrome. Concentrate familial resources and expectations on a single child, particularly in urban middle class Han Chinese families. Traditional Chinese values emphasize family duty and filial piety, but the policy amplified parental investment in the child's success seen as the family's future. Economic reforms in the 80s and 90s also raised living standards, enabling parents to lavish resources on their child. Cultural preference for son exacerbated by sex-related practices, boys were likely to be spoiled as precious heirs, though girls in progressive or urban families also experienced similar dynamics. Entitlement and self-centeredness. With six adults catering to their needs, some children developed a sense of being the center of the universe. This could manifest as expecting constant attention or struggling with compromise. Overindulgence. Parents often overprovided material goods, toys, gadgets, or academic support, tutoring, extracurriculars, fostering dependency or unrealistic expectations. For example, grandparents might handle daily tasks like cooking or cleaning to free the child for study. Pressure to succeed. The child bore the weight of familial aspirations, leading to intense academic pressure. Success in exams. The Gaokao College entrance exam was seen as critical for social mobility, creating stress or perfectionism. Social challenges. Without siblings, some children struggle with sharing, conflict resolution, or peer socialization. Urbanization and small family units further limit interaction with extended families or peers. Not all outcomes were negative. Many little emperors developed confidence, ambition, and individualism, traits valued in China's competitive economy. Higher parental investment often led to better education and career outcomes. Very interesting. Considering that many young people are choosing to be entrepreneurs in the West, how does that affect culture and society as whole? What are some interesting downstream effects of that on everyday life? Okay, this is very interesting. Very interesting. Psychological studies. Early studies found only children in China showed higher academic achievement but mixed social outcomes, with some displaying self centeredness or lower emotional resilience. Later research suggested differences were less pronounced as parenting styles varied. Cultural perception versus reality. Media and Western observers often exaggerated the syndrome, portraying spoiled, obese, or socially inept children. However, surveys found many only children were well adjusted, with traits shaped more by urbanization and education than by policy alone. Roughly 150 million only children were born under the policy, mostly in urban areas. This large cohort, now in their 20s to 30s, shape China's workforce and society, making the syndrome's impact a topic of ongoing study. Family dynamics. Parental sacrifice often prioritize the child's needs over their own, delaying retirement or spending savings on education, housing. This reinforced the child's role as the family's hope. Filial piety strain. Only children faced pressure to care for aging parents and grandparents without siblings to share the burden. This is acute today, with 18.7% of China's population over 60. Boys were more likely to be overindulged, while girls in urban families often faced similar expectations but with less entitlement, reflecting evolving gender norms. Economic contributions and challenges. High skilled workforce. The focus on education produced a generation of skilled professionals. For example, only children dominate China's urban middle class, driving tech and service sectors. Consumerism. Grew up with material abundance, fueling China's consumer economy. Young adults today spend heavily on luxury goods, travel, and tech, with urban consumption rising 8% annually in the 2010s. Workplace dynamics. Some employers report that only children struggle with teamwork or resilience. though this is anecdotal. Others praise their ambition and adaptability in competitive settings. Social cohesion, individualism versus collectivism. The syndrome is credited with fostering individualism, challenging China's collectivist traditions. This is evident in urban youth prioritizing personal goals over family or state expectation. Marriage and relationships. Some studies suggest only children face challenges in the relationship due to high expectations or poor conflict resolution skills. Okay, let's see. The rise of young people choosing entrepreneurship in the West, particularly in the US, Canada, and Europe, has significantly shaped culture, society, and everyday life. This trend, fueled by technological access, cultural shift toward individualism, and dissatisfaction with traditional career paths, has both direct and downstream effects. Let's see. Let's see. Cultural and societal impacts of rising entrepreneurship. Normalization. Increasingly glorified with figures like Elon Musk as cultural icons, surveys show 40% of US adults aspire to start a business, up from 25% in 2000. This reflects a move away from valuing stable corporate careers toward self reliance and innovation. Unlike China's little emperor generation, where individualism emerged under familial pressure, Western youth embraced entrepreneurship as a rejection of hierarchical systems, seeking autonomy over security. Media, reality TV, and social platforms romanticize the hustle culture, embedding risk taking and self branding into societal values. Economic diversification and innovation, startup boom. The US alone saw 5.4 million new business applications in 21, a record high, with millennials and Gen Z driving much of the growth. This fuels innovation in tech, e commerce, and sustainability. Gig economy integration. Many young entrepreneurs operate in the gig economy, freelancers, content creators, blurring lines between traditional employment and self employment. By 23, 36% of US workers were gig based. Societal impact. This diversifies economies but increases income volatility, challenging traditional social safety nets like pensions or healthcare tied to corporate jobs. Workplace transformation, flexible work norms. Entrepreneurs prioritize flexibility, accelerating remote work and digital nomadism. 32.6 million Americans are projected to work remotely, partly driven by startup culture. 20% of the workforce. Wow. 32.6 million. Contrast with China. Face intense academic pressure for stable careers. Western entrepreneurs redefine success as creative control, influencing broader workplace expectations for work life balance. Interesting downstream effects on everyday life. Urban and suburban design of co working spaces and hubs. The rise of startups has spurred demand for co working spaces, reshaping urban landscape. By 24, global co working spaces grew to 35,000. Cafes and public spaces now double as informal offices, changing how people interact in cities. Gentrification and migration. Young entrepreneurs cluster in tech hubs, Austin, Berlin, driving up housing costs and gentrifying neighborhoods. This pushes lower income residents out, altering community dynamics. For example, Austin's medium home price rose 40%. Everyday impact. Daily commute shift from corporate offices to flexible workspaces. Urbanites encounter more pop up markets, food trucks, and niche businesses run by young entrepreneurs, enriching but also commercializing public spaces. Consumer behavior and market fragmentation. Niche products and personalization. Entrepreneurs leverage e commerce and social media to offer hyper specialized products from vegan skincare to custom pet accessories. Global e commerce sales hit 5.7 trillion in 22, with small businesses driving growth. Subscription culture. Startups popularize subscription models, meal kits, fitness apps embedding recurring cost into daily budgets. By 25, 75% of direct to consumer brands will offer subscription. Shopping becomes more online and curated, with consumers supporting small brands over corporations. Daily life includes more deliveries, unboxing experiences, and social media driven purchases, but also decision fatigue from endless options. Social relationship and community dynamics. Network driven socializing. Entrepreneurship fosters hustle networks with meetups, pitch events, and online communities, replacing traditional social circles. 60% of Gen Z entrepreneurs prioritize networking over leisure friendship. Mm. Isolation risk. The pressure to succeed can isolate entrepreneurs, mirroring China's Little Emperor social challenges. Mental health issues are rising, with 72% of entrepreneurs reporting stress related concerns. Social interactions tilt toward professional gain, with coffee chats doubling as pitches. Dating apps reflect this, with profiles boasting startup credentials. Community events like farmers markets increasingly feature entrepreneurial ventures, blending commerce with socializing. Education and skill acquisition. Self education boom. Young entrepreneurs bypass traditional degrees using platforms like YouTube, Coursera, or X for skills like coding or marketing. Only 36% of Gen Z believe college is essential for success, down from 50%. Side hustles is norm. Entrepreneurship normalizes side gigs, with 46% of US millennials running one. This shifts education toward practical, immediate skills. Daily routines include more self directed learning, podcasts during commutes, coding at night. Schools and libraries adapt, offering maker spaces or startup workshops, embedding entrepreneurial thinking into youth culture. Financial habits and economic instability, risky financial behavior. Self fund startups via personal savings or debt, with 62% using personal funds. Failure rates are high. 50% of startups fail within 5 years, leading to financial precarity. Crowdfunding and investment culture. Platforms like Kickstarter and Patreon integrate crowdfunding into daily life, with 6.4 billion raised globally. Friends and family are pitched as investors, blurring personal and financial ties. Everyday impact. Budgeting becomes erratic, with young people juggling gig income, startup costs, and lifestyle expenses. Social media flaunts entrepreneurial wins, pressuring peers to invest in crypto, NFTs, or side hustles, amplifying financial risk taking. Mental health and lifestyle shifts. The always on entrepreneurial mindset amplified by social media leads to burnout. A 23 study found 45% of Gen Z entrepreneurs reported anxiety tied to financial uncertainty. Wellness entrepreneurship. In response, many entrepreneurs launch wellness startups, meditation apps, fitness coaching, with a global wellness market reaching 5.6 trillion in 2022. Daily routines and corporate wellness practices. Mindfulness apps, gym subscriptions marketed by entrepreneurs, but the pressure to optimize life adds stress. Social media scrolling mixes inspiration with envy as peers showcase startup success. Interesting. Tell me about the population collapse narrative in USA and Canada. Wow, 43 minutes. My throat is already starting to hurt. Okay. Declining birth rates. Okay. Both the US and Canada have fertility rates below their placement level of 2.1, needing to maintain a stable population without immigration. The US fertility rate was 1.62 in 23, while Canada's hit a historic low of 1.4. Longer life expectancy and fewer births are increasing the proportion of elderly citizens. In the US, the over 65 population is projected to rise from 17% in 21 to 29% by 2100. Expected to grow from 18.5% in 21 to 25.9% by 2068. Economic and social strain. Voluntary retirees threatens labor shortages, strained social safety nets, social security, Medicare, Canadian pension plan, and reduced economic growth. The US labor force is projected to grow by only 0.2% annually. Immigration dependency. Both countries rely on immigration to offset natural population decline, births minus deaths. Without immigration, Canada's population growth could approach zero in 20 years, and the US population is projected to peak at 370 million in 2080 before declining to 366 million by 2100. Canada's population growth could approach zero in 20 years, and the US population is projected to peak at 370 million in 2080. Cultural anxiety. Some narratives, especially on platforms like X, frame population decline as a cultural or civilizational crisis, citing low fertility in Western nations compared to higher rates in developing regions. This often ties to nationalism or fears of demographic replacement. Low fertility in Western nations compared to higher rates in developing regions. This often ties to nationalism or fears of demographic replacement. Hmm. Drivers of the narrative. Economic pressures, high cost of living, housing unaffordability, and stagnant wages discourage family formation. In the US, raising a child costs $237,000 over 18 years, leading 44% of non parents under 50 to say they are unlikely to have kids. Canada faces similar pressure with urban housing crisis. Young people prioritize career education and personal fulfillment over parenthood. The entrepreneurial trend you mentioned amplifies this, as starting a business often demands time and financial resource, dealing or reducing family planning. This mirrors China's Little Emperor syndrome, where individual ambition overshadows traditional family roles. Increased education and workforce participation for women correlate with lower fertility. In Canada, fertility declines align with urbanization and women's autonomy, a trend also seen in the US. COVID 19 reduced immigration. US net immigration fell below 250,000 in 21 and further depressed birth rates, though immigration has since rebounded in Canada. Evidence supporting the narrative. US projections. The US Census Bureau projects population growth of only 9.7% from 22 to 2100, peaking in 370 million in 2080 before declining. Natural increase, births minus deaths, will turn negative by 2038 without immigration. Canada's trends. Canada's natural increase accounts for less than one third of population growth, with migratory increase driving two thirds. Without immigration, growth could stall by 2040. Economic risk. An aging population strains public services. In the US, Social Security is projected to fall short by 2033. In Canada, the dependency ratio over 65 to working age is expected to rise 20% in 2 decades, increasing pressure on healthcare and pensions. Labor shortages. Both countries face workforce aging. By 2030, 150 million G7 jobs will shift to workers over 55, exacerbating shortages as fewer younger people enter the labor market. Counter arguments and critiques, not a collapse. The term collapse is alarmist. Population decline is gradual and both countries have decades to adapt. Global population is still growing, projected to peak at 10.3 billion in 2080, suggesting no universal crisis. Immigration is a buffer. Canada's robust immigration policy, highest per capita among G7, historical reliance on immigrants, Medicaid decline. Canada's population is projected to grow to 47.8 million by 2043, largely due to immigration. Technological adaptation. Automation, AI, and entrepreneurship driven innovations, startups in tech or wellness can offset labor shortages. Companies are already adopting remote work and professional development to attract younger workers. Some argue lower populations in high consumption nations like the US and Canada reduce environmental strain, aligning with climate goals. This counters narratives framing decline as solely negative. Social resilience. Societies have historically adapted to demographic shifts. The entrepreneurial mindset among Western youth, emphasizing flexibility and problem solving, could drive solutions like new care models or economic structures, unlike China's more rigid familial expectation. Downstream effects on everyday life. The population collapse narrative combined with the entrepreneurial trend reshapes daily life in the US and Canada in ways that intersect with the cultural shifts you highlighted. Workforce and workplace changes. Entrepreneurial influence. Young entrepreneurs' preference for flexibility accelerates remote work and gig economies. This reduces traditional office commutes, changing urban daily routines. Labor shortage impact. More tech driven, with young workers juggling side hustles or startups, but older workers face pressures to delay retirement, altering workplace dynamics. Gentrification, Toronto, San Francisco. Smaller households. On career lead to smaller single person households, increasing demand for micro apartments or co living spaces. This shifts neighborhood vibes with more co working cafes and fewer family oriented parks. Navigating pricier urban areas with pop up businesses, food trucks, niche retail run by entrepreneurs, filling gentrified spaces, but affordable housing becomes a daily stressor. Social and family structure. Delayed parenthood. Entrepreneurs' time intensive careers delay marriage and childbirth, reinforcing low fertility. This echoes China's little emperor pressure, which stems from personal ambition rather than familial duty. Caregiving burdens. With fewer siblings, young people face solo responsibility for aging parents. Impact. Daily social life tilted towards professional networking. Startup meetups over family gatherings. With caregiving apps or services becoming routine, but emotional isolation grows as family sizes shrink. Economic and consumer trends, niche markets. Entrepreneurs capitalize on demographic shifts, launching products for aging population, health tech, senior wellness, or child-free lifestyles. Travel subscriptions, pet services. E-commerce driven by startups shapes daily shopping habits. Financial precarity. Entrepreneurial risk taking combined with fewer workers supporting retirees increases economic volatility. Daily budgets reflect this, with young people balancing startup investments and rising taxes for social programs. Everyday consumption involves more online personalized purchases from startups, but financial stress from supporting aging systems affects discretionary spending. Culture and political polarization, narrative amplification. The collapse narrative fuels cultural debates, with some framing low fertility as a Western decline, stoking nationalism or anti-immigration immigrant sentiment. Okay, really cool.